There's a document sitting inside a glass case in Turin, Italy, that the ancient Egyptians themselves wrote on papyrus over 3,000 years ago, and what it records in its opening columns has never been satisfactorily explained by mainstream Egyptology. It is not a religious text. It is not a myth. It is a king list, a structured administrative record of rulers, organized by dynasty with their names and the duration of their reigns, written out in careful hieratic script by a professional scribe working in the royal archives. The kind of document that ancient governments kept for the same reason modern governments keep records, to establish who held power, for how long, and in what order. The problem is what appears at the beginning of the list, before the historical pharaohs begin. Before Menes, who is credited as the first king of the first dynasty and the man who unified Egypt around 3100 BCE, the Turin Papyrus records not a blank space, not a symbolic preface, but an actual numbered sequence of rulers organized into dynasties. These rulers are not identified as gods in some loose mythological sense. They are listed in the same format as the historical kings: name, dynasty, years of reign, except for two details that stop every serious Egyptologist who reads them cold. First, the names are not the names of any historical figures we have ever identified. Second, the reign lengths are enormous. The papyrus records that the Shamsu Hor, a group of pre-dynastic rulers whose name translates directly as the followers of Horus, ruled Egypt for 13,420 years. And before them, the text records a further 23,200 years of reigns by an even earlier group of rulers. The total, across both groups, is 36,620 years of organized governance before the first historical dynasty began. These are the numbers recorded in the document, not invented by a modern researcher, not pulled from a fringe theory. Recorded by an Egyptian scribe in the 19th dynasty, working from administrative records that were already ancient in his own time, on a papyrus that has been held in the Egyptian Museum in Turin since 1824 and studied by professional Egyptologists ever since. The scholars who have worked most closely with this document do not claim those numbers are literal. The consensus in mainstream Egyptology is that the astronomical reign lengths reflect a literary or symbolic convention for conveying extreme antiquity, the same kind of numerical inflation that appears in the Sumerian king list for the period before its own great flood. What the scholars cannot easily explain away is the structure itself. The Egyptian scribes who compiled this document believed, or were recording a tradition that believed, that organized rulership over Egypt did not begin with Menes. It began so far before Menes that it was effectively in a different age of the world. And the Egyptians did not only record this in the Turin Papyrus, they recorded it again on the Palermo stone, a basalt stele carved during the 5th dynasty around 2400 BCE, which preserves the names of pre-dynastic kings for whom there are no tombs, no monuments, and no archaeological record. Only their names, preserved in stone by a civilization that remembered they had existed even when every physical trace of their world had vanished. They recorded it in the writings of the Egyptian priest Manetho, who compiled a history of Egypt in Greek during the 3rd century BCE and explicitly described an era before the human pharaohs, during which the followers of Horus governed the Nile Valley, followed them by an age he called the reign of demigods, followed by another of spirits, and only then the historical dynasties beginning with Menes. And they recorded it in a tradition so old and so consistently maintained across 3,000 years of Egyptian writing that it cannot be dismissed as a late invention or a single scribe's error. The ancient Egyptians knew that something had existed before them, something organized, something that ruled the same land they ruled, along the same river they lived beside, before their own history began. Now here is where it gets genuinely complicated in the best possible way, because we have been digging up the pre-dynastic period of Egypt for over 150 years, and what the archaeology has found does not contradict the written record. It extends it. 250 miles south of Cairo, on the west bank of the Nile near a bend in the river, there is a site that archaeologists first systematically excavated in the 1890s, and have been returning to ever since. Its ancient Egyptian name was Nekhen. The Greeks called it Hierakonpolis, the city of the falcon. And it is the most important pre-dynastic site in Egypt, possibly the most important pre-dynastic site in the entire ancient world. At its height, in the period archaeologists call Naqada II, roughly between 3600 and 3300 BCE, Hierakonpolis extended approximately 2.5 kilometers along the Nile and over 3 kilometers east to west into the desert. In a period before the first dynasty, before any recognized pharaoh had taken the throne, before Egypt, as we understand it, existed at all, this city covered an area of roughly 7.5 square kilometers and supported a population that researchers estimate at 10,000 people or more. 10,000 people in an organized urban center with specialized craftsmen, elite burials, ceremonial architecture, and a social hierarchy sophisticated enough to leave traces that are still being excavated today, more than 5,000 years later. The excavation team working at Hierakonpolis, led for decades by Dr. Renee Friedman of the British Museum, has uncovered a range of finds at the elite cemetery designated HK6 that has continuously forced the revision of what we thought we knew about the period before Egypt's recorded history began. The cemetery contains the largest tombs of the early Naqada II period known anywhere. These are not simple pit graves. They are large brick-lined structures, some with above-ground wooden architectural enclosures surrounding them, with evidence of funerary temples attached to the tomb complexes. The earliest evidence of above-ground funerary architecture found anywhere in Egypt, predating the structures of the historical dynasties by many centuries. Inside and around these tombs, the excavations have found something that nobody expected. Animals. Not sacrificed in a casual way, but deliberately carefully placed. Elephants, hippos, cattle, baboons, wildcats, even a hartebeest, interred alongside human occupants in a pattern of burial that reflects an elaborate ceremonial system with rules and meanings that the pre-dynastic inhabitants of Hierakonpolis clearly understood completely, even though we are still working to decode it. The painted tomb at Hierakonpolis, discovered in 1899 and now recognized as one of the most significant finds in Egyptian archaeology, contains the oldest figurative wall painting ever found in Egypt. It predates the wall paintings of the dynastic period by centuries, and what it depicts is organized, thematic, compositionally deliberate imagery, boats, human figures in procession, animals, scenes of conflict and ceremony, painted by someone who was not inventing this visual language for the first time, but working within an established tradition that already had conventions and expectations. This is not the art of people who were just beginning to develop a civilization. This is the art of people who were already deep inside one. Now go back to the hieroglyphs. Because the written record and the archaeological record are pointing at the same thing from two different directions, and the intersection between them is more interesting than either source alone. The Egyptian texts describe the pre-dynastic period using a specific vocabulary. The rulers before the historical dynasties are called the Shamsu Hor, and this phrase means literally those who follow Horus, not worship Horus, follow. The grammatical construction implies movement, succession, a relay of authority, as if there is a line of transmission extending backward through time beyond any point the historical Egyptians could trace to its origin. Manetho, working from temple records that were already ancient in his own day, described the Shamsu Hor as semi-divine figures, not full gods, but something between gods and ordinary human kings. He placed them as a distinct category between the era of the gods and the era of the human pharaohs, and he described them as the transmitters of sacred knowledge, the people who carried what the gods had established forward in time until the first human dynasty was ready to receive it. The dynastic Egyptians did not build on nothing. They inherited something. And the question that the archaeology of Hierakonpolis has been making more and more urgent with every excavation season is exactly what that something was. Look at what the historical dynasty inherited, not the myths. The actual technical and cultural package that appears, essentially fully formed, at the beginning of Egyptian recorded history. Writing. The hieroglyphic system appears at the very start of the dynastic period with a complexity and a completeness that does not fit comfortably into the model of a writing system being invented from scratch in a single generation. The earliest hieroglyphs, found at Abydos, dating to around 3200 BCE, are already a sophisticated system capable of recording administrative and religious information with specificity and nuance. They do not read like a first draft. They read like a system that has already been in use long enough to have stabilized and matured. Architecture. The first dynasty structures at Abydos and Saqqara, the great mud brick mastabas of the earliest pharaohs, are not experiments in how to build a large enclosure. They are competent, organized, large-scale constructions that reflect established knowledge of planning, materials, labor organization, and structural principles. The people who built them already knew how to build them before they started. Ritual and cosmology. The religious system of dynastic Egypt. The mythology of Horus and Set, the concept of divine kingship, the afterlife theology, the relationship between the king and the cosmic order, does not appear to develop gradually during the historical period. It appears at the beginning of that period already organized, already internally consistent, already elaborated to a degree that implies a long prior period of theological development. Where did these things develop? The mainstream answer is that they developed during exactly the pre-dynastic period, across the Naqada cultures spanning roughly from 4000 to 3100 BCE, with Hierakonpolis as the leading political and cultural center of what eventually unified to become the Egyptian state. This is not wrong. The archaeological evidence supports it. Hierakonpolis is where the Narmer Palet was found, the carved ceremonial slate object that many Egyptologists consider the world's first historical document depicting the king Narmer in the act that traditional scholarship identifies as the unification of Egypt. It came from a temple deposit at Hierakonpolis, along with hundreds of other ceremonial objects, votive offerings, and ritual items that had been placed in that temple over many centuries before the object was buried in a deposit cache. The temple itself is extraordinary. It is one of the oldest formal religious structures ever excavated. Its oval courtyard, defined by wooden posts in the Naqada II period, is already too sophisticated to be an early experiment. Someone built this, knowing what a formal sacred precinct was supposed to be and how it was supposed to function. So what the archaeology tells us is this: before Egypt, there was Hierakonpolis. And before the Hierakonpolis we can excavate, there are the traditions recorded in the Turin Papyrus and in Manetho's history describing an organized political structure stretching back further than we can dig. But there is one more layer to this story that most discussions of pre-dynastic Egypt leave out entirely. And it is the layer that connects the written record about who came before Egypt to a physical location that has been partially excavated and partially blocked by geography for over a century. Hierakonpolis is not only a surface site. Beneath it and around it, there are features of the landscape that the pre-dynastic inhabitants clearly understood and used. The desert behind the city is cut by a dry watercourse, a wadi, that runs from the high desert down toward the Nile plain. This wadi was where the brewery was, one of the largest ancient breweries ever excavated, capable of producing industrial quantities of beer in a period before the First Dynasty. It was also where the ceremonial center was. And it was where, partially exposed and partially still buried, the oldest elite structures in Egypt sit waiting for more systematic excavation. Beneath the surface of the Naqada II city, below the floors of the latest occupation levels, there are earlier levels. And below those, earlier still. The site has been continuously occupied since at least 4000 BCE, and the full depth of that occupation has never been fully excavated because the scale of the site makes complete excavation a generational project rather than a seasonal one. What has been found in the lower levels is consistent with a single continuous tradition, not a replacement population. Not a new culture arriving and displacing an older one. The same tradition growing more elaborate over time, with the oldest layers reflecting practices and organizational complexity that the later layers inherited rather than invented. This is exactly what the Turin Papyrus describes. Not a separate alien civilization arriving from outside. Not a gap in the record where everything was destroyed and rebuilt from nothing. A tradition, a continuous line of authority and knowledge running backward in time further than the historical record reaches, carried by the Shamsu Hor through the period we call pre-dynastic, delivered into the hands of the first pharaohs at the moment of unification, and then encoded in the writing system, the architecture, the religious cosmology, and the ceremonial practices of the civilization we recognize as ancient Egypt. The city they left underground is Hierakonpolis, partially excavated, partially still beneath the desert floor, covering 7.5 square kilometers that have never been fully mapped, with lower levels that have barely been touched, with a wadi sanctuary whose full extent is not known, with an elite cemetery that has been under active excavation since 1979 and continues to produce finds that rewrite the textbooks. When the dynastic Egyptians looked back at their own origins, they did not see a gradual climb from primitive beginnings. They saw a tradition handed to them by people who already knew things. They encoded that belief in the Turin Papyrus, in the Palermo stone, in the writings of Manetho, in the title Shamsu Hor itself. They were not making up mythology about a golden age that never existed. They were describing, in the language and conceptual framework available to them, the real cultural inheritance they had received from a pre-dynastic civilization that preceded them along the same river, in the same landscape, building toward the same endpoint across a span of time that felt, to those who inherited it, like it must have stretched back to the gods themselves. The hieroglyphs recording all of this are not hidden. They have been translated, published, and studied for over a century. The archaeology supporting them is actively ongoing, with new finds at Hierakonpolis appearing in peer-reviewed journals every few years. The city beneath the desert is not sealed or forbidden. It is simply large and deep and not yet fully understood. What it represents is something more interesting than a mystery. It is evidence that the civilization we call ancient Egypt was the inheritor of something older, that the people who built the pyramids and carved the hieroglyphs and established the longest-lasting organized culture in human history were standing on the shoulders of people whose names only survive in fragmentary papyrus records, and whose monuments are still being dug out of the desert one excavation season at a time. Before Egypt, there was the city. Before the city, there was the tradition. Before the tradition, the Shamsu Hor carried what had come before them forward through time, and they left it in the stone, the writing, the ceremonial system, and the buried foundations of the oldest urban center on the African continent for the people who came after them to inherit. The Second Empire did not disappear. It became the first one we remember. Now I want to hear what you think about the pre-dynastic period specifically. Because the debate about how continuous this tradition really was Whether Hierakonpolis represents a single unbroken cultural line stretching back to the Shamsu Hor, or whether there are disruptions and replacements in the record that we have not yet identified, is a genuinely live question in Egyptology right now. Leave your reading in the comments. I read everyone, and the best responses on this channel come from people who have gone and looked at the actual sources, rather than waiting for someone else to summarize them. If you are not subscribed yet, the next video in this series goes somewhere I have been building toward for several weeks. We are going to look at a set of hieroglyphs found at Abydos, the city the pre-dynastic kings used before Hierakonpolis lost its political primacy, that describe, in direct and specific terms, what the Shamsu Hor were responsible for preserving, and why the first historical pharaohs treated that inheritance as the most sacred thing in Egypt. The Second Empire built the foundation, the First Empire built on top of it, and the ground underneath both of them has barely been touched. There is a detail about Hierakonpolis that almost never makes it into popular accounts of pre-dynastic Egypt, and it is one of the most significant things the site has produced in over a century of excavation. In 2002, a team working in the HK6 Elite Cemetery uncovered the remains of what they initially identified as a large post-built structure surrounding one of the major tombs of the early Naqada II period. As they excavated further, the full picture emerged. The structure was not a simple enclosure. It was a funerary precinct, a defined sacred space built with wooden columns arranged in precise rows, containing a central tomb, evidence of ritual deposits, and the remnants of what appears to have been a limestone statue placed in a position of veneration east of the burial chamber. This is the earliest above-ground funerary architecture ever identified in Egypt. Not early dynastic, not late pre-dynastic in the narrow sense. Early Naqada II, meaning it predates the first historical dynasty by anywhere from 300 to 500 years, depending on which calibration of the radiocarbon dates you accept. Someone built a formal sacred precinct around a burial in the middle of the 4th millennium BCE. They arranged wooden columns in rows. They placed a carved stone figure to receive offerings. They defined a space as sacred and maintained it as such across multiple generations, because later burials in the same cemetery show awareness of and respect for this earlier structure, inserting themselves around it rather than through it. This is institutional memory. It is the physical evidence of a culture that understood permanence, venerated its own past, and organized its religious practice around specific places in the landscape, rather than treating each burial as an isolated event. This is not the behavior of a society that is just beginning to organize itself. This is the behavior of a society that has been organized for long enough to have developed traditions about how the past should be honored. And Hierakonpolis was doing this while the rest of the ancient world was, by most conventional accounts, still working out the basics. Now hold that image in mind and go back to the hieroglyphs one more time. The Turin Papyrus does not just list the Shamsu Hor as a dynasty of rulers. It places them within a cosmological framework that the Egyptian scribes clearly considered historically accurate rather than purely symbolic. The papyrus opens with the gods themselves as rulers: Ra, Shu, Geb, Osiris, Set, Horus, Thoth, Mot, each listed with a reign length and a place in the sequence. Then come the demigods, the transitional figures, then the Shamsu Hor, then Menes. This is a continuous sequence. It is not a myth section followed by a history section with a clear dividing line between them. The scribes who compiled it treated the entire sequence as a single continuous record of who had governed Egypt in temporal succession, from the moment governance began to the moment they were writing. They did not see a discontinuity between the age of the gods and the age of human kings. They saw a handoff, a succession, a tradition passed from one category of ruler to the next through a series of deliberate transfers. The concept they use to describe this is one that appears throughout Egyptian religious and administrative texts, the word Mat. Usually translated as truth, justice, or cosmic order, Mat is better understood as the correct alignment of all things. The state in which the universe functions as it should, in which the king rules justly, in which the Nile floods at the right time, in which the dead reach their destination, in which the living fulfill their obligations. The Egyptians believed that maintaining Mat was the primary duty of the pharaoh, and that the pharaoh's ability to maintain it was directly dependent on his connection to those who had maintained it before him. The chain of succession was not just political, it was cosmic. Every pharaoh was a link in a chain that extended backward through the Shamsu Hor to the gods themselves, and forward through his own successors to the eternal maintenance of the world's proper order. To break that chain was not just a political crisis, it was a cosmic one. This is why the king lists existed, not merely as administrative records, as proof of the chain, as documentation that the current holder of power was a legitimate link in an unbroken succession stretching back to the first time the world was organized correctly. The Turin Papyrus, the Palermo Stone, Manetho's history, all of them are performing the same function, They are demonstrating that the civilization they describe is not a new thing, but a continuation of something eternal, rooted in a past so deep that ordinary historical measurement cannot reach its beginning. And Hierakonpolis, sitting in the desert 250 miles south of Cairo, is the physical place where the most critical transition in that chain occurred. Where the pre-dynastic tradition of the Naqada cultures, the tradition the Turin Papyrus encodes as the Shamsu Hor, handed authority to the first historical dynasty and the world we call ancient Egypt began. The Narmer palette was found there, in the deposit cache of the oldest formal temple on the Nile. Narmer himself, the king depicted in the act of unification, is identified by most Egyptologists with the figure whom later tradition remembered as Menes, the first name in the historical section of the Turin Papyrus, the king immediately following the last entry of the Shamsu Hor. The handoff happened at Hierakonpolis, on the same ground where the earliest elite burials are, where the earliest above-ground funerary architecture is, where the oldest formal religious precinct is, where the earliest figurative wall painting in Egypt is, where the largest pre-dynastic urban settlement ever found extends 3 kilometers into the desert with lower levels that have barely been touched. Every layer you go down at that site is another layer of the civilization that the first pharaohs inherited. Every object recovered from the HK6 cemetery is something that the Shamsu Hor, or whoever the actual pre-dynastic rulers of that city were, considered important enough to bury with their most powerful dead. Every wooden post of every funerary enclosure is a physical mark made by people who had no writing but had a complete and elaborated understanding of what sacred space was and how it should be structured. The city they left underground is not mythological. It is not a symbol. It is an archaeological site under active excavation in Qena Governorate, Egypt, accessible by road from Luxor, covered in part by modern occupation and desert sediment, with thousands of years of layered human presence sitting between the surface and the oldest remains. The tradition they left above ground became ancient Egypt, became the hieroglyphs, became the pyramids, became the most studied, most written about, most visually recognizable ancient culture in human history. Every image of a pharaoh wearing a double crown is a direct inheritance from the moment when the pre-dynastic ruler of Hierakonpolis combined the white crown of his own city with the red crown of the north and stood in the temple of the falcon god, holding the pallet that would be buried in that temple's deposit and found again 4,500 years later. The Second Empire did not vanish. It became the foundation. It became the bedrock on which everything else was built. And the hieroglyphs that the first dynasty scribes carved into stone, working in a writing system that the pre-dynastic tradition had already spent centuries developing, were themselves the monument to the transition. The moment when what had been carried forward by the Shamsu Hor through the deepest layers of human prehistory along the Nile became permanent, became written, became the record we have been reading ever since, trying to understand where it all came from and who built the world beneath the world we can see. The answer is in the ground at Hierakonpolis. It has been there, being excavated one careful field season at a time, since 1897. And every year, something comes out of that ground that makes the standard account of how Egypt began just a little more complicated and just a little more interesting than it was the year before. That is the story the hieroglyphs are telling. Not the story of a civilization that appeared from nowhere with its writing and its sacred architecture and its elaborate cosmology already fully formed. The story of a civilization that received all of those things from the people who came before it, who received them from the people who came before them, in a chain of transmission that the Egyptians themselves believed stretched all the way back to the moment the world was first set in order. The Shamsu Hor were the keepers of that order between the age of the gods and the age of the pharaohs, and the city where they kept it is still there, under the desert, waiting. To understand why this matters so much, you need to understand what the first historical dynasty actually found when it arrived at Hierakonpolis. Because the picture that emerges from the excavation reports is not the picture of a conquering culture moving into an undeveloped landscape. It is the picture of a new administration inheriting an existing infrastructure so sophisticated that it continued operating under new management with almost no visible disruption. The temple at Hierakonpolis did not stop receiving offerings when the pre-dynastic period ended and the dynastic period began. The excavation of the votive deposit, the cache of objects buried in the temple precinct, contains items spanning multiple centuries from both before and after unification. The same sacred space was being used continuously. The same ritual practices were being performed. The institution survived the political transition because the institution was older than the politics and more fundamental to the life of the city than any particular dynasty's claim to govern it. The same pattern appears at Abydos. The royal cemetery at el-Kab, where the earliest historical pharaohs of the first dynasty were buried, contains pre-dynastic graves of elite figures immediately beneath and around it. The first human kings of Egypt chose to be buried in the same ground, where the pre-dynastic rulers before them were buried, because burial in that ground was part of what made you a legitimate ruler. The ground itself carried authority, because the ground remembered who had used it before. This is the physical expression of the same idea encoded in the Turin Papyrus. The chain of legitimacy ran through specific places as much as through specific people. To hold the double crown and to be buried at Abydos and to maintain the temple at Hierakonpolis was to be a link in a chain that ran backward through the Shamsu Hor to the gods themselves. To do all of those things was to maintain Mat, to be the living continuation of an order so old that even the most detailed royal records the Egyptians kept could not reach its beginning. Now, the scholars who specialize in this period spend considerable energy debating exactly where the boundary between mythology and history should be drawn in the Egyptian record, and this is a genuinely important and unresolved question. The reign lengths in the Turin Papyrus for the pre-dynastic section are not historical in the way that the reign lengths for Ramesses II's or Thutmose III are historical. The Shamsu Hor are not a sequence of individual rulers we can identify, date, and cross-reference against archaeological evidence the way we can with the historical pharaohs. The category is real. The term appears in the texts. The tradition of a pre-dynastic period of organized rule is consistent across multiple independent sources, but the specific chronological framework the Turin Papyrus provides for that period cannot be taken as a literal record. What can be taken seriously, and what the archaeology demands we take seriously, is the underlying claim that there was an organized civilization here long before Egypt's recorded history began.